Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The content presented in this video, including all sociological data, demographic analysis, historical trends, and discussions surrounding family law, is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. This material does not constitute professional legal counsel, financial advisement, marital therapy, or psychological support. The historical trends and case studies discussed throughout this series do not predict, guarantee, or reflect the potential outcomes of any individual's personal circumstances. State laws regarding marriage, separation, and asset division vary considerably across the United States, and the macro-level data we are exploring should never serve as a substitute for professional guidance. We strongly encourage all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified, licensed professionals, such as family law attorneys, financial planners, or certified counselors, regarding any personal legal or marital decisions. Our objective is to analyze historical data and regional statistics, not to provide individualized advice or a roadmap for personal legal actions. Picture the quintessential American South. It is a region deeply steeped in tradition, where the rhythm of life often revolves around close-knit communities, generational family ties, and deeply rooted religious institutions. It is a landscape historically painted with Sunday morning church services, sprawling front porches, and a cultural narrative that vehemently champions the sanctity of marriage and traditional family values. If you were to ask the average American to point to the region of the country where marriage is most stable, where the nuclear family is most resilient against the modern pressures of fracture and dissolution, they would almost certainly point their finger squarely at the Bible Belt. The cultural branding of the American South is virtually inseparable from the concept of enduring family loyalty and lifelong commitment. Yet, when we strip away the romanticized folklore and examine the hard, unforgiving numbers reported by the United States Census Bureau and the National Center for Health Statistics over the last 50 years, a stark, almost unbelievable reality emerges. The American South is not the bastion of marital stability it is widely presumed to be. In fact, it is the exact opposite. For decades, the states with the highest divorce rates in the entire nation have not been the coastal, supposedly progressive strongholds of California, Massachusetts, or New York. Instead, the epicenter of American marital dissolution is firmly planted in states like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Kentucky. This is what sociologists and demographers refer to as the red state paradox. How is it mathematically and sociologically possible that the region with the most conservative cultural values, the highest rates of weekly religious attendance, and the strongest stated emphasis on the permanence of marriage simultaneously produces the highest volume of divorce decrees? This cognitive dissonance represents one of the most fascinating, misunderstood, and heavily shielded demographic realities in the United States. To understand the magnitude of this paradox and to stop falling for the surface-level stereotypes, we have to dive deep into the specific, compounding, and often invisible pressures that uniquely affect Southern households. We are talking about a highly volatile, complex web of geographical, economic, and cultural variables that create a literal pressure cooker for young couples. Consider the historical trends regarding the age of first marriage. In many Southern communities, there is immense cultural, familial, and social pressure to marry young, often immediately after high school or during the early years of college. While marrying young is championed as a moral ideal and a sign of maturity in these specific communities, decades of longitudinal data reveal a much darker reality. Marrying before the age of 25 is one of the single greatest statistical predictors of future divorce. When you combine this culturally incentivized early entry into marriage with the specific economic realities of the rural and suburban South, such as consistently lower median household incomes, higher regional rates of poverty, and severely limited access to upwardly mobile career trajectories, you create a volatile environment where financial stress immediately begins to fracture the foundational bedrock of the relationship. Financial instability is universally recognized by psychologists and economists alike as a primary catalyst for marital conflict, and in the South, this instability often hits couples who are still mentally, professionally, and emotionally developing. Furthermore, we must examine the historical trends of educational attainment in these regions, which heavily correlate with both lifetime earning potential and marital longevity. The data presents an undeniable, mathematically proven correlation. Populations with higher concentrations of college degrees and postgraduate education tend to delay marriage until they are older, possess significantly greater financial stability, and subsequently exhibit drastically lower divorce rates. Conversely, regions with lower educational attainment metrics consistently reflect higher rates of early marriage followed by a cascade of early divorces. But the story does not end with simple economics and chronological age. There is a deeply ingrained, almost invisible cultural dynamic at play that forces the hand of countless individuals. When the prevailing regional culture dictates that cohabitation before marriage is socially unacceptable or morally failing, young couples who wish to build a life together, or simply escape their childhood homes, often feel overwhelmingly compelled to rush into a legally binding union, just to avoid the scrutiny of their community. They walk down the aisle fueled by intense societal expectations, rather than a mature, stress-tested foundation of compatibility and shared financial planning. What happens when the honeymoon phase inevitably fades? The medical and housing bills begin to pile up, and the crushing weight of adult reality sets in. The very institutions and community voices that push them into the marriage often become utterly silent or actively judgmental, when the marriage begins to inevitably fray under the strain of these structural disadvantages. This leads to a fascinating and tragic cycle of early marriage, rapid dissolution, and interestingly enough, a statistically higher rate of quick remarriage in the South compared to other regions, which in turn leads to even higher rates of secondary and tertiary divorces. The statistical landscape is staggering, and the human stories hidden behind these sterile numbers are deeply complex, challenging absolutely everything the media has taught you about American family dynamics. So, what exactly are we going to uncover in this deep dive masterclass, and what precise problem does this solve for you today? Whether you are actively studying demographic shifts, navigating the increasingly complex world of modern relationships and legal contracts yourself, or simply trying to make logical sense of the intense cultural divides in the United States, understanding the hidden mechanics of Southern divorce trends provides a crucial master key to decoding American society as a whole. By the end of this comprehensive series, you will possess a rigorous, data-driven understanding of the precise economic, psychological, and cultural forces that secretly dictate marital success and failure in America. We will systematically dismantle the prevailing myths and equip you with a highly nuanced, analytical perspective on how regional economics, educational disparities, and unspoken cultural expectations silently script the trajectory of our most intimate legal relationships. You will no longer view marriage and divorce statistics as mere abstract numbers on a screen, but as a profound, predictable reflection of the structural realities that shape human behavior. We are going to explore detailed historical trends, examine rigorous sociological case studies, and map out the exact step-by-step sequence of societal events that quietly transformed the Bible Belt into the divorce capital of the country. This knowledge will fundamentally shift how you perceive cultural narratives, allowing you to see completely through the political and societal noise to the hard, undeniable data underneath. This is not just a geographical study of the American South. This is a comprehensive masterclass in understanding the powerful, invisible forces that govern the modern American family and dictate the long-term survival of the marital contract. To truly grasp the magnitude of this phenomenon, we must first examine the chronological starting line of these relationships. In the field of demography, there is a universally recognized metric that acts as the ultimate predictor of marital stability, and that is the age at first marriage. Throughout the American South, historical trends consistently demonstrate a cultural timeline that places young adults at the altar years before their peers in the Northeast or the West Coast. We are not just talking about a statistical anomaly, we are looking at a deeply ingrained regional expectation. When sociologists analyze the life cycles of relationships, they identify the years between 18 and 24 as a period of massive, turbulent psychological and emotional development. During this window, individuals are actively forming their core identities, establishing their long-term career aspirations, and learning how to navigate complex adult social dynamics independently. When an individual legally binds themselves to another person before this critical developmental phase is complete, they are essentially making a lifelong commitment on behalf of a future version of themselves that does not yet exist. They are entering into the most complex legal and financial contract of their lives without a fully formed sense of individual self. Imagine if you were 20 years old, living in a suburban community in Alabama or Oklahoma in the current year 2026. The economic landscape is challenging, inflation affects every grocery purchase, and the housing market demands significant capital for entry. Yet, almost every social signal you receive from your immediate community, your extended family network, and your local leadership equates personal success and moral maturity directly with settling down and starting a family. You are standing at the intersection of adolescence and adulthood, and the cultural map you have been handed points directly and exclusively to the wedding aisle. You are not structurally encouraged to spend your 20s exploring different geographic regions, advancing through multiple exploratory career phases, or aggressively building an independent financial portfolio. Instead, the ultimate celebrated achievement is securing a spouse. This creates a powerful, invisible current that sweeps young adults into legally binding partnerships long before they have the structural foundations necessary to support those partnerships. Let us examine a realistic case study drawn from established sociological patterns to understand the potential outcomes of this environment. Consider two individuals we will call David and Sarah, living in a traditional Southern community in 2026. They graduate high school and immediately transition into a serious courtship. By the time they are 21, they are married. Their local community celebrates this union enthusiastically, viewing it as a triumph of traditional values and proper life progression. However, the economic reality of the 2026 American landscape is entirely unforgiving to households lacking advanced human capital. Neither David nor Sarah has completed a 4-year college degree or obtained specialized, high-yield vocational training, which significantly caps their initial and long-term earning potential. They enter the workforce at the entry level, simultaneously attempting to manage a leased apartment, secure reliable transportation, and cover rapidly rising basic living expenses. The financial friction begins almost immediately, and it is absolute. Without the critical buffer of established savings accounts, investment portfolios, or high-yield career trajectories, every unexpected expense transforms instantly into a monumental crisis. A sudden medical bill or a major vehicle repair does not just cause temporary budgetary stress. It actively fractures the foundational trust and emotional security of the marriage. When we analyze historical trends of divorce across the entire United States, financial incompatibility and chronic, low-grade money stress consistently rank as the primary catalyst for legal separation. In the South, this financial pressure cooker is frequently activated before the couple has even learned how to communicate effectively as autonomous adults. As David and Sarah navigate their early 20s, the initial romantic phase of their relationship is entirely eclipsed by the grueling, daily logistics of surviving from one paycheck to the next. They are forced to grow up under immense pressure, and without the luxury of time and resources to develop together, they frequently begin to grow in entirely different, incompatible directions. The psychological toll of this continuous financial anxiety manifests in deep resentment, frequent arguments over basic resource allocation, and a profound, expanding sense of personal isolation. They executed the exact life plan their culture demanded of them, yet they find themselves struggling intensely just to keep their heads above water. This brings us to the critical intersection of educational attainment and marital longevity, which starkly illuminates the red state paradox. The demographic data presents an undeniable correlation. Populations that delay marriage to pursue higher education or advanced technical training fundamentally alter their lifetime trajectory. They spend their early 20s accumulating human capital, learning complex problem-solving skills, establishing a professional network, and achieving financial autonomy. By the time these individuals enter a marriage in their late 20s or early 30s, they bring a massive surplus of resources to the partnership. They have established identities, clearer conflict resolution patterns, and crucially, the financial bandwidth to absorb inevitable life shocks. Conversely, the Southern cultural push for early marriage frequently derails this educational timeline entirely. When the immediate goal is funding a wedding and establishing a separate household, long-term educational investments are frequently categorized as unaffordable luxuries or unnecessary delays. This creates a compounding structural disadvantage that echoes through generations. The young couple is trapped in a systemic cycle of immediate financial survival, leaving absolutely zero margin for error. What makes this demographic trend exponentially more severe is the intense social isolation that accompanies early marital struggles in highly traditional communities. When a regional culture heavily idealizes the concept of lifelong marriage, admitting to profound dissatisfaction, contemplating therapy, or discussing divorce is often viewed as a severe societal taboo. Young couples who are actively drowning in financial and emotional stress feel they cannot speak openly about their daily challenges without facing intense judgment from the exact same community that eagerly celebrated their wedding day. They suffer in complete silence, masking their accelerating marital decay behind forced smiles at Sunday gatherings and family events. This absolute lack of an open, supportive dialogue prevents couples from seeking early intervention and dramatically accelerates the permanent deterioration of the relationship. They are trapped in a societal system that heavily incentivizes the wedding day itself, but provides almost zero structural or economic support for the challenging decades that follow. But economic pressure and chronological age are only the surface layers of this incredibly complex sociological puzzle. There is an even more powerful, deeply hidden engine driving the massive Southern divorce machine, and it involves the very institutions you would naturally expect to prevent it. We are about to uncover how the specific religious infrastructure of the South, the exact organizations fiercely preaching lifelong commitment, actually create a paradoxical environment that systematically pushes certain couples toward the divorce courts at record speeds. To understand this paradox, we must dissect the incredibly pervasive influence of the religious infrastructure that defines the American South. The Bible Belt is far more than just a geographic designation or a collection of historical trends regarding weekly church attendance. It is a comprehensive, all-encompassing cultural ecosystem that actively governs social mobility, community reputation, and the fundamental milestones of adulthood. In many secular or progressive regions of the United States, the societal blueprint for long-term relationships incorporates a built-in, culturally accepted stress test, which is cohabitation. Living together before marriage serves as a critical trial period, where couples navigate the mundane but highly volatile realities of shared finances, division of domestic labor, and daily conflict resolution. However, within the traditional religious communities of the South, cohabitation is frequently met with severe social stigmatization. It is often categorized not as a pragmatic step toward building a stable future, but as a profound moral failing that damages the reputation of both the couple and their extended families. This deeply entrenched taboo against cohabitation creates a massive, invisible pressure system. Imagine if you are a young adult named Michael, living in a tight-knit community in Tennessee in the current year 2026. You have been dating a woman named Emily for 8 months. The economic reality of 2026 is harsh, with high inflation drastically inflating the cost of rent and basic groceries. From a purely logistical and financial standpoint, moving into a single apartment together makes perfect economic sense. Furthermore, as young adults in their early 20s, biological imperatives and the natural human desire for physical and emotional intimacy are operating at peak levels. However, Michael and Emily know that signing a lease together without a marriage license would result in immediate ostracization from their core social support network, judgmental whispers within their congregation, and deep disappointment from their parents. The cultural framework they inhabit offers only one socially sanctioned pathway to achieve independence from their childhood homes, to pool their financial resources, and to experience adult intimacy without guilt. That single pathway is an immediate, legally binding marriage. Therefore, couples like Michael and Emily are systematically incentivized to rush toward the altar. They are pushed to legally formalize their relationship, not because they have spent years rigorously testing their compatibility through adversity, but because marriage is the only culturally approved key that unlocks the door to independent adult life. This is where the historical trends regarding purity culture intersect disastrously with the realities of modern domestic life. When a cultural system demands absolute abstinence before marriage, it inadvertently transforms the wedding day into a frantic finish line, rather than a thoughtful starting point. Young adults sprint toward this finish line, driven by natural biological desires, and the intense yearning to finally be recognized as autonomous adults by their community. They bypass the critical, necessary phases of negotiating deeply rooted personal differences, learning how the other person reacts under severe professional stress, and observing how their partner manages complex financial decisions. They step into the most heavily regulated legal contract of their lives, entirely blind to the actual day-to-day operational reality of their chosen partner. Let us examine another highly specific case study to map out the potential outcomes of this cultural phenomenon. Consider a couple named Christopher and Jessica, residing in Georgia in 2026. They meet within a structured, highly supervised college ministry program. Their courtship is brief, intensely emotional, and entirely shielded from the harsh realities of the secular world. Motivated by the immense social pressure of their peers, who are all simultaneously getting engaged, and the strict moral guidelines of their community, they marry at the age of 22. The wedding is a massive community celebration, heavily reinforcing the idea that they have successfully achieved the ultimate moral and societal milestone. However, the exact moment the honeymoon concludes, Christopher and Jessica are violently thrust into a domestic reality for which they have absolutely zero practical preparation. Because they never experienced the cohabitation stress test, They discover their profound incompatibilities simultaneously and under the suffocating weight of a legally binding contract. Jessica discovers that Christopher possesses fundamentally different philosophies regarding debt management and credit card utilization, a terrifying realization in the challenging economic climate of 2026. Christopher discovers that Jessica processes emotional conflict through withdrawal and silence, a communication style that triggers his own deeply rooted anxieties. These are not minor inconveniences. These are fundamental, structural fractures in the relationship that typically surface during the early dating or cohabitation phases. Because Christopher and Jessica bypass those phases to satisfy the demands of their religious culture, these foundational cracks appear only after it is legally and socially catastrophic to address them. This brings us to the most tragic element of the red state paradox. The very institutions that successfully enforce the rigid rules leading up to the marriage are frequently entirely unequipped to provide practical, evidence-based support once the systemic fractures begin to multiply. When couples like Christopher and Jessica seek help from their community leadership for severe financial disagreements or toxic communication loops, the counsel provided is overwhelmingly spiritualized rather than structurally practical. Instead of being directed toward certified financial planners or licensed psychological therapists who utilize evidence-based conflict resolution frameworks, they are frequently instructed to pray harder, to attend more religious services, or to simply adhere more strictly to traditional, patriarchal household roles. When these spiritualized solutions completely fail to resolve the very tangible mathematical problem of an overdrawn bank account, or the psychological damage of persistent emotional neglect, the couple begins to experience a profound sense of total failure. They feel they are failing not just as a marital unit, but as moral individuals. The intense shame associated with this perceived failure drives them further into isolation. They realize that the community that eagerly celebrated their union has no practical safety net to catch them as their household collapses. They are trapped in a societal system that heavily engineered their rapid entry into the marriage, but completely abandoned them to the complex, brutal logistics of actually sustaining it. The pressure mounts to an unbearable degree. The emotional isolation becomes absolute, and the environment becomes entirely unsustainable. But what happens when the breaking point is finally reached? When the cultural shame is no longer enough to keep the fractured household intact, these couples discover a shocking structural reality waiting for them. We must now turn our attention to the actual legal machinery of the American South, because waiting just beneath this highly conservative cultural surface is a legislative framework that makes the process of legally dissolving a marriage faster, cheaper, and fundamentally easier than almost anywhere else in the United States. This legislative reality presents one of the most glaring contradictions in American jurisprudence. When we analyze historical trends across the nation, we uncover a fascinating political paradox. The very same states that consistently vote for conservative policies, advocate for traditional family structures, and emphasize the sanctity of the marital bond are simultaneously governed by a fundamentally libertarian approach to family law. In the American South, the overarching political philosophy heavily prioritizes limited government intervention and the deregulation of private contracts. This political ideology naturally extends into the realm of family law. Consequently, while the cultural and religious friction against divorce is incredibly high, the actual structural legal friction is astonishingly low. To fully comprehend this dynamic, we must examine the specific mechanics of state-level divorce statutes and compare the legal pathways available to residents in different regions of the country. Let us explore the concept of the waiting period, which is a mandated duration of time a couple must wait between filing the initial divorce petition and the finalization of the decree. In many northeastern or west coast jurisdictions, the state essentially forces the couple to slow down, mandating extensive cooling-off periods that can last for 6 months to over a year, especially if minor children are involved. Some states even historically required a formalized, legally documented period of physical separation before the court would even entertain a divorce filing. Now imagine if you are a young adult named Matthew living in Arkansas or Mississippi in the current year 2026. If Matthew and his spouse reach the breaking point we discussed earlier, they do not face a labyrinth of state-mandated therapy, forced long-term separation, or extensive bureaucratic delays. Depending on the exact circumstances and the presence of children, the historical trends of family law in several southern states dictate waiting periods as remarkably short as 30 to 60 days for an uncontested divorce. The legal escape hatch is not securely bolted shut, it is practically left wide open. This speed is compounded by the sheer economic accessibility of legal dissolution in these regions. In states like New York or California, the sheer cost of living naturally inflates the cost of legal representation. Retaining a family law attorney can require thousands of dollars up front, creating a massive financial barrier that effectively forces lower-income couples to remain legally tethered simply because they cannot afford to untie the knot. However, in the rural and suburban South, the legal system has highly adapted to the economic realities of its demographic. We see widespread utilization of pro se litigation, a legal term meaning to represent oneself without an attorney. County courthouses across the Bible Belt frequently provide highly streamlined, incredibly simple standardized forms for uncontested divorces. If a young couple, completely drained by the financial pressures of 2026, possesses no significant shared assets, no complex real estate portfolios, and agrees on the fundamental terms of their separation, they can navigate the entire legal process for little more than the cost of a county filing fee. Consider a case study of a theoretical couple, John and Amanda, who rushed into marriage at 19 due to intense purity culture pressures in their local Texas community. 3 years later, drowning in credit card debt and entirely emotionally fractured, they decide they can no longer sustain the facade. Because they are renting an apartment and have not accumulated a shared pension or complex investments, their legal uncoupling is remarkably straightforward. They download a standardized pro se divorce packet from their local county website. They fill out the paperwork at their kitchen table, detailing the division of their minimal personal property and their shared debt. They drive to the local courthouse, pay a filing fee that might range from $200 to $300, and submit the petition. Because they agree on all terms, it is filed as an uncontested no-fault divorce. The state law demands a mere 60-day waiting period. Once that brief chronological window expires, they may not even need to stand before a judge in a formal courtroom setting. A judge reviews the standardized paperwork in their chambers, signs the final decree, and John and Amanda are officially legally divorced. The entire process, from the final breaking point argument to the arrival of the stamped legal dissolution in their mailbox, can take less than 10 weeks and cost less than a set of new tires. This hyper-efficient legal machinery creates a unique psychological environment. When the cultural pressure cooker we analyzed in the previous section finally explodes, the individuals involved discover that escaping the marriage legally is often exponentially easier than enduring the social shame of staying in a broken one. The state government essentially steps back, refuses to heavily interrogate the reasons for the separation, and processes the paperwork with brutal administrative efficiency. This is the core of the libertarian influence on conservative family law. The state views the marriage as a civil contract between two private individuals, and if both individuals agree to terminate that contract, the state will not stand in their way, regardless of the cultural optics. This structural reality completely undermines the outward religious messaging of the region. The church may preach that marriage is an unbreakable, eternal covenant, but the state legislature explicitly defines it as a highly dissolvable, easily terminated civil agreement. The potential outcomes of this systemic clash are clearly visible in the demographic data. You have a massive population of young adults who are systematically pressured into early marriage by their community, structurally disadvantaged by lower regional median incomes and educational attainment, completely isolated by a culture that stigmatizes marital counseling, and then provided with a highly efficient, low-cost legal mechanism to completely vaporize the marriage the moment it becomes unsustainable. It is an incredibly precise, multi-stage sociological assembly line that continuously manufactures early divorces. The friction of entering the marriage is incredibly low due to cultural encouragement, and the legal friction of exiting the marriage is equally low due to state deregulation. However, the execution of this legal paperwork does not somehow magically erase the intense cultural conditioning that pushed these individuals into marriage in the first place. This is where the demographic data takes a truly unprecedented, almost unbelievable turn. John and Amanda are now legally divorced in their early 20s. They are single, legally free, and carrying the heavy social stigma of a failed marriage in a highly traditional community. They are completely exhausted. Yet the overarching societal message that personal value and moral standing are inextricably linked to being married has not changed one single bit. The local culture still looks at single adults with profound suspicion. So what exactly does a 23-year-old divorcee do in a community that fundamentally distrusts unmarried people? They do the only thing their environment encourages them to do. They immediately re-enter the dating pool, completely unprocessed and highly vulnerable. setting the stage for a statistical phenomenon that is even more volatile than the first marriage. We must now examine the intense, rapid-fire cycle of the Southern rebound, and how the staggering rates of quick remarriages are actively fueling a hidden epidemic of secondary and tertiary divorces that are permanently altering the American family tree. This phenomenon, known in sociological circles as the Southern rebound, is perhaps the most heavily concealed aspect of the regional divorce paradox. To comprehend the sheer velocity of this cycle, we must first examine the psychological landscape of a newly divorced 20-something living in a deeply traditional community in the current year 2026. The ink on the legal dissolution paperwork is barely dry, yet the societal pressure to conform to a coupled status remains absolutely relentless. In many of these rural and suburban ecosystems, the entire social infrastructure is fundamentally organized around the nuclear family unit. Social gatherings, religious services, neighborhood events, and even professional networking opportunities are implicitly designed for couples. For a young adult who recently exited a starter marriage, navigating this environment as a single individual creates an overwhelming sense of alienation. They are essentially treated as a social anomaly, a missing puzzle piece in a community that fundamentally distrusts extended periods of singleness. The cultural narrative whispers and sometimes shouts that personal redemption and societal reintegration can only be achieved by finding a new partner and trying again, and trying quickly. Imagine if you are a young man named Brian living in South Carolina in 2026. You married your high school sweetheart at 20, and by 23, the financial friction and emotional incompatibility we discussed earlier drove you to the local courthouse for a remarkably swift pro-se divorce. You are now 23 years old, carrying a moderate amount of shared credit card debt from the previous marriage, and feeling the immense, crushing weight of failure. You return to your local congregation or community center, seeking support, only to find that the social circles you once effortlessly navigated as a married man have subtly closed their ranks. The community does not offer robust support groups for young divorcees navigating single adulthood. Instead, the well-meaning but deeply flawed advice from family and mentors almost universally points toward getting back out there. The underlying message is that your single status is a temporary, highly undesirable holding pattern, driven by a volatile cocktail of intense loneliness, unresolved emotional trauma, and an overwhelming desire to regain your lost social standing. You're enter the dating pool. But you are not dating with the mature, cautious perspective of someone who has healed. You are dating with the frantic urgency of someone trying to stop the bleeding. Historical trends and demographic data clearly illustrate the potential outcomes of this frantic urgency. Southern states consistently report not only the highest rates of primary divorce, but also some of the highest and fastest rates of remarriage in the entire nation. It is a demographic conveyor belt of serial monogamy cloaked in traditional values. Individuals like Brian quickly find new partners who are often carrying their own identical baggage from their own early, failed marriages. They connect over their shared trauma, misinterpreting trauma bonding for genuine, sustainable compatibility. Because the cultural taboo against cohabitation remains rigidly in place, even for second marriages, they once again bypass the critical stress testing phase of living together. Within 12 to 18 months of their respective divorces, they are standing at the altar once more, absolutely convinced that this time will be different because they are slightly older. However, the sociological data surrounding second and third marriages paints a devastatingly bleak picture. While exact percentages fluctuate depending on the specific demographic subsets, historical trends consistently demonstrate that second marriages fail at a significantly higher rate than first marriages, often exceeding a 60% failure rate, and third marriages face an even steeper climb, frequently approaching a 75% dissolution rate. Why do these subsequent marriages shatter with such astonishing frequency? The answer lies in the massive, invisible accumulation of structural and psychological baggage. When Brian enters his second marriage, he is no longer starting with a blank slate. He is bringing the unresolved communication deficits that destroyed his first union, deficits that he never addressed because the culture stigmatizes professional therapy and pushes immediate remarriage instead. Furthermore, the financial dynamics are now exponentially more complicated. Second marriages in this demographic often involve the consolidation of dual sets of debt acquired during the previous marriages and the subsequent legal uncouplings. If the individuals are paying alimony or managing the lingering legal fees from a contentious prior separation, the new household is immediately starved of vital economic resources. The financial pressure cooker that broke the first marriage is essentially turned up to an absolute maximum before the second honeymoon even begins. They are trying to build a new house on a foundation that is actively sinking under the weight of past financial mistakes. We must also examine the incredibly complex variables introduced when minor children are involved. If either partner in this rapid remarriage cycle brings children from a previous relationship, the newly formed blended family faces astronomical emotional and logistical hurdles. The traditional Southern cultural infrastructure, which strongly prioritizes the biological nuclear family, frequently offers zero practical framework or institutional support for the highly nuanced challenges of step-parenting, blended sibling dynamics, and managing complex custody schedules with ex-spouses. Case studies of blended families in these regions reveal intense boundary disputes, disciplinary confusion, and massive loyalty conflicts that place unbearable strain on the new marital bond. The new couple is forced to navigate these explosive domestic landmines while simultaneously trying to learn how to be married to each other, all under the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of a community that expects them to seamlessly project the image of a perfect traditional family. When the pressure inevitably becomes too much, the exact same libertarian legal system that facilitated their first quick divorce is waiting with open arms to facilitate their second. This creates an incredible sociological irony. The American region that most loudly champions the permanent, unbreakable sanctity of the marital contract has inadvertently engineered a massive, self-sustaining ecosystem of serial marriage and rapid legal dissolution. It is a tragic loop of societal expectation, rapid legal execution, cultural shame, and frantic, unprepared remarriage. The adults caught in this cycle are exhausted, constantly restructuring their finances, and enduring repeated psychological trauma. But they are not the only ones paying the price for this massive cultural paradox. As this cycle of instability repeats itself across millions of households throughout the Bible Belt, it generates a massive blast radius that completely consumes the most vulnerable members of society. What happens to the children who are forced to ride this chaotic carousel of changing households, shifting parental figures, and perpetual economic insecurity? We have to shift our focus to the collateral damage of the red state paradox, because the generational inheritance being passed down in these rapidly fracturing homes is actively rewriting the economic future of the entire region. Let us dive into the devastating long-term economic and psychological inheritance of the Southern divorce machine. When the fragile legal and financial architecture of a young Southern marriage collapses, the resulting debris field does not neatly confine itself to the two adults named on the court docket. The most profound and lasting devastation is absorbed by the children who are forcibly drafted into a life of systemic instability. To understand the true cost of the red state paradox, we must look at the mathematical reality of a household fracturing. When a family unit dissolves, the exact same pool of income that was previously struggling to sustain a single home is violently bifurcated. It must now stretch to cover two separate rent payments, two distinct sets of utility bills, duplicate grocery runs, and the added transportation costs required to facilitate legally mandated custody exchanges. In the American South, where historical trends consistently show median household incomes lagging behind the national average, this division does not simply result in a tighter budget. It frequently precipitates an immediate, catastrophic plunge below the poverty line. The financial buffer, if one ever existed, is completely vaporized by the sheer logistical overhead of maintaining two distinct domestic infrastructures. Imagine if you are an 8-year-old child named Jackson, living in a rural county in Mississippi in the current year 2026. Your parents, who married at 20 due to the overwhelming cultural pressures we previously outlined, have just finalized their incredibly swift, low-friction divorce. Your mother, who perhaps paused her educational or early career development to manage the household and raise you, is now designated as the primary custodial parent. In the unforgiving economic climate of 2026, characterized by sticky inflation and skyrocketing housing costs, her entry-level wages are mathematically incapable of providing the stability you previously knew. Jackson experiences an overnight, brutal downgrade in his baseline standard of living. He is forced to move out of the familiar family rental home and into a smaller, high-density, lower-income apartment complex. The ambient stress level within his immediate environment exponentially multiplies. His mother is chronically exhausted from working multiple shifts just to meet the bare minimum caloric and housing needs of her family. The psychological bandwidth she previously had available to nurture his development is entirely consumed by the absolute panic of daily financial survival. This immediate economic destabilization triggers a cascading series of secondary crises, the most damaging of which is severe educational disruption. Because affordable housing is frequently transient in these specific economic brackets, Jackson is highly likely to face multiple residential moves over the next several years. Every time the rent increases beyond his mother's highly restricted budget, they are forced to relocate. With every geographic shift, Jackson is abruptly yanked out of his school district. He loses his established peer support networks. He is separated from educators who understand his specific learning style, and he is repeatedly forced to navigate the terrifying social hierarchy of a brand new cafeteria and classroom. Historical trends and rigorous longitudinal studies in the field of educational sociology present a grim reality regarding these potential outcomes. Children who experience multiple, involuntary residential and educational transitions score significantly lower on standardized reading and mathematics assessments. They exhibit drastically higher rates of chronic absenteeism, and their statistical probability of eventually dropping out of high school entirely skyrockets. The chronic ambient stress of his home life elevates Jackson's cortisol levels, biologically impairing his developing brain's capacity to focus, retain new information, and successfully regulate his emotions in a classroom setting. But the instability for children like Jackson does not end with economic scarcity and geographic displacement. We must now factor in the massive, compounding variable of the Southern rebound. Because his community heavily stigmatizes single parenthood and intensely pressures adults to quickly remarry, Jackson is not given a period of calm to adjust to his new reality. Instead, within 12 to 18 months, a completely new authoritative figure is introduced into his highly volatile ecosystem. His mother or father remarries, initiating a complex, deeply confusing blended family dynamic. Jackson is now forced to adapt to a step-parent who brings an entirely different set of disciplinary rules, communication styles, and domestic expectations. If this new step-parent also brings children from a previous rapid divorce, Jackson finds himself suddenly competing for incredibly scarce emotional and financial resources within his own home. He is living in a permanent state of hypervigilance, constantly trying to read the shifting emotional weather of adults who are themselves profoundly stressed and entirely unequipped to manage the intricate psychology of a blended household. This relentless cycle of primary divorce, sudden poverty, geographical uprooting, and rapid chaotic remarriage serves as an aggressive factory for generating adverse childhood experiences, clinically referred to as ACEs. In the realm of public health, ACEs are used to measure the accumulation of traumatic events during the foundational years of neurological development. The demographic reality of the Southern divorce machine means that millions of children in this region are quietly accumulating dangerously high ACE scores. This is not merely a matter of temporary sadness or typical childhood growing pains. It is a profound biological and psychological rewiring. High concentrations of adverse childhood experiences are heavily correlated with severe potential outcomes in adulthood, including exponentially higher risks of developing substance abuse dependencies, crippling anxiety disorders, chronic depressive episodes, and a severely stunted capacity for healthy conflict resolution. We are observing a massive regional public health crisis that is actively masquerading as a localized series of private family court disputes. As Jackson and countless children like him navigate this chaotic landscape and eventually reach the threshold of young adulthood, a terrifying generational replication occurs. They arrive at the age of 18 carrying immense psychological baggage, lacking a secure financial safety net, and possessing a deeply warped internal blueprint of what a romantic relationship actually entails. They have spent their entire lives observing that the marital contract is simultaneously the most culturally demanded achievement and the most easily discarded legal arrangement. Because they are desperate for the stability and emotional security they were completely denied in childhood, and because they are still operating within the exact same deeply traditional cultural ecosystem that pressured their parents, they make the exact same critical error. They seek immediate salvation in early marriage. They rush to the altar to escape the chaos of their childhood homes, completely unaware that they are lacking the fundamental communication skills and financial maturity necessary to survive the commitment. Thus, the massive Southern divorce machine is successfully restarted for an entirely new generation, creating a perfectly closed, self-sustaining loop of socio-economic suppression that quietly drains the vitality of the entire region. When you zoom out and analyze the macroeconomic reality of this multi-generational cycle, the true scope of the disaster becomes undeniably clear. You are not just looking at a cultural anomaly. You are witnessing a catastrophic regional economic headwind. A massive, statistically significant segment of the future workforce is entering the adult economy already severely handicapped by childhood trauma, educational disruption, and a negative net worth. This effectively suppresses the overall economic mobility, innovation capacity, and industrial growth of entire states. The red state paradox is not just producing broken hearts, it is systematically manufacturing generational poverty. But as this cycle churns out millions of financially destitute, legally severed households, how exactly does the local government manage the brutal logistics of this poverty? When a county judge is forced to mathematically divide an already insufficient, entry-level income to somehow keep two separate, fractured households from completely collapsing into homelessness, what actual legal mechanisms are deployed? The child support formulas, the highly punitive alimony statutes, and the aggressive collection tactics utilized in these specific jurisdictions reveal a terrifying, highly mathematical reality that completely traps both the custodial and non-custodial parents in a legally binding state of near destitution. We must now open the ledger and look directly at the brutal, unyielding financial math of the Southern family court system, and what we find there will completely change how you view the intersection of law and poverty in America. When a family court judge in a rural Southern county strikes their gavel to finalize a divorce decree, they are technically operating under the established legal doctrine of equitable distribution. In the halls of legal academia, equitable distribution is a sophisticated framework designed to fairly divide the accumulated wealth of a marital partnership. It conjures images of lawyers meticulously splitting equity in a primary residence, dividing the vested balance of retirement portfolios, and calculating the future value of stock options. However, when you apply this high-minded legal theory to the demographic reality of young working-class couples in the American South in the current year 2026, the entire concept completely disintegrates. The brutal reality of the red state paradox is that there is absolutely no wealth to divide. Instead of splitting assets, the family court system is tasked with the impossible mathematical equation of dividing poverty. They are taking a single, already insufficient household income and legally attempting to stretch it across two entirely separate domestic infrastructures. The mathematical foundation of this process is inherently flawed, yet the state enforces it with absolute, unyielding authority. To understand how this system traps young families, we must closely examine the mechanical function of state-mandated child support formulas. Many jurisdictions utilize what is known as the income shares model. On paper, this model seems incredibly logical. It is designed to estimate the total amount of money the parents would have spent on the child if the household had remained intact, and then it divides that financial obligation between the two parents based on their respective proportional incomes. But the fatal flaw in this formula is that it operates in a sterile theoretical vacuum. It frequently fails to account for the catastrophic, real-world overhead costs of maintaining a newly fractured household in a high-inflation environment. The state calculates a gross income figure, plugs it into a rigid bureaucratic worksheet, and generates a non-negotiable monthly payment order. The court does not care that the cost of basic groceries has skyrocketed, or that a one-bedroom apartment now consumes 60% of a worker's take-home pay. The ledger demands its balance, and the state commands compliance. Imagine if you are a 24-year-old man named Marcus, living in a sprawling suburban district of Alabama in 2026. You married at 20, divorced at 23, and you share 50-50 custody of a toddler. You work full-time in a regional distribution warehouse, earning $22 an hour. While that wage might sound functional in a historical context, in the economic reality of 2026, after federal taxes, state taxes, and basic healthcare premiums are deducted, Marcus is bringing home roughly $2,800 a month. The state child support worksheet dictates that Marcus must pay his ex-wife $600 a month to maintain his legal obligations. Immediately, Marcus is left with $2,200. His rent for a modest, safe apartment where his child can stay during his custody days is $1,400. He is now down to $800 to cover electricity, water, internet, car insurance, vehicle maintenance, gasoline, and enough food to feed himself and a growing child. It is not just difficult, it is a mathematical impossibility. There is absolutely no margin for error. The moment Marcus experiences a single financial shock, the entire legal structure collapses on top of him. If his car requires a new transmission, or if his hours at the warehouse are temporarily reduced during a slow economic quarter, he misses a child support payment. In the Southern family court system, missing a payment does not initiate a compassionate review of your financial circumstances. It triggers an aggressive, highly punitive collections apparatus. Marcus is now officially in arrears. The state immediately begins adding substantial interest penalties to his missed payments, causing the debt to compound rapidly. When the debt reaches a specific threshold, the state escalates to wage garnishment. A court order is sent directly to Marcus's employer, forcibly extracting up to 50% of his disposable income before he ever sees a paycheck. This aggressive garnishment guarantees that Marcus cannot possibly pay his rent, initiating a terrifying slide toward eviction and homelessness. But the systemic punishment does not stop at the paycheck. If wage garnishment fails to satisfy the compounding debt, the state deploys one of its most devastating and counterproductive legal weapons: the suspension of the driver's license. In dense northeastern cities with robust public transportation networks, losing a driver's license is a severe inconvenience. In the sprawling, geographically expansive landscape of the American South, where public transit is virtually non-existent, losing your driver's license is an absolute economic death sentence. Marcus cannot legally drive to the warehouse to earn the exact wages the state is demanding he pay. If he chooses to drive with a suspended license out of pure desperation, he risks immediate arrest, vehicle impoundment, and catastrophic legal fees that will permanently bury him in debt. He is trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where the state demands financial compliance, while simultaneously stripping him of the only tools he has to generate that capital. When Marcus inevitably fails to produce the mandated funds, the final stage of the enforcement process is activated. He is summoned to family court and found in civil contempt. Because he has violated a direct court order to pay, the judge has the legal authority to incarcerate him. Marcus is placed in the county jail. While he is sitting in a holding cell, he is obviously earning zero wages, yet the child support meter continues to run, accumulating even more debt and interest. He eventually emerges from the county jail with a massive stain on his background check, drastically reducing his future employability, and a mountain of legal arrears that he can never realistically hope to repay. Sociologists and legal scholars have correctly identified this cycle as the modern equivalent of a debtor's prison. It is a highly efficient machine that permanently criminalizes poverty under the guise of family law. The non-custodial parent is pushed entirely out of the legitimate workforce and forced into the underground, cash-only economy just to survive, completely severing their ability to be a present, stable figure in their child's life. Simultaneously, we must look at the devastating potential outcomes for the custodial parent. The mother on the other side of this legal ledger is not getting rich off this system. She was relying on that $600 a month just to keep the lights on and prevent her own eviction. When the state system aggressively crushes Marcus and drives him out of the formal economy, the child support checks completely vanish. The mother is left holding a worthless court order, while her own financial reality plummets below the poverty line. Both parents, who just a few years earlier were enthusiastically celebrating a culturally mandated early marriage, are now completely destitute, utterly exhausted, and bound together by a hostile, inescapable legal ledger. The system designed to enforce responsibility has instead guaranteed mutual financial destruction. But what happens when both private citizens are completely emptied of their resources? When the father is rendered unemployable and the mother cannot afford basic groceries, the crisis does not simply evaporate. The financial burden shifts. The absolute last line of defense is triggered, leading to one of the greatest political hypocrisies in the entire region. We are about to examine how this explosion of legally bankrupt families creates a massive multi-billion-dollar tidal wave that crashes directly into state welfare programs, forcing deeply conservative governments to quietly fund the exact social safety nets they publicly campaign against. This collision between private family failure and public taxpayer liability represents the ultimate ideological contradiction of the region. When the private nuclear family structure completely collapses and both parents are rendered financially insolvent by the punitive legal mechanisms we previously detailed, the immense burden of survival does not simply vanish into thin air. It is immediately and forcefully transferred directly to the state and federal taxpayer. The American South is a region historically and politically defined by a fierce commitment to limited government intervention, rugged individualism, and a deep vocal skepticism of social welfare programs. Political campaigns in these jurisdictions are routinely won on promises to slash public assistance and promote self-reliance. Yet, decades of demographic and economic data reveal a starkly different reality. Because the cultural infrastructure aggressively promotes early marriage, and the legal infrastructure facilitates rapid, impoverishing divorces, These very same states consistently rank as the highest consumers of state and federal assistance programs in the entire nation. This is the heavily guarded, hidden cost of the Southern divorce machine. When a family court judge signs a decree that mathematically guarantees the impoverishment of a custodial parent, they are simultaneously signing an application for massive, long-term state aid. Let us examine the precise step-by-step mechanisms of this systemic dependency. When a custodial mother realizes the state-mandated child support checks have permanently ceased because her ex-husband has been pushed into the underground cash economy to avoid arrest, she faces a terrifying, existential crisis. In the high-inflation economic environment of the current year 2026, her entry-level salary is mathematically incapable of covering the basic overhead of a fractured household. She is left with absolutely no alternative but to enter the very welfare bureaucracy her local culture actively stigmatizes. She is forced to apply for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, historically known as food stamps, simply to secure basic caloric intake for her growing children. She must enroll her family in Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program, because the premiums for private health insurance would consume her entire remaining paycheck. She places her name on the multi-year, severely backlogged waiting list for Section 8 housing vouchers just to avoid imminent eviction. Imagine if you are a 26-year-old woman named Rachel living in a rural parish in Louisiana in 2026. You followed the exact cultural script handed to you by your community. You married at 19, had 2 children by the age of 21, and found yourself navigating a rapid, pro-se divorce by 23. Your ex-husband, overwhelmed by the compounded arrears and the suspension of his driving privileges, has completely dropped out of the formal labor force. You are working 40 hours a week as a medical receptionist, earning a wage that leaves you roughly $600 short of basic survival every single month. Rachel is not looking to exploit the system. She is desperately executing emergency triage to keep her children out of homeless shelters. She walks into the local Department of Children and Family Services to apply for benefits. The waiting room is not filled with anomalies. It is entirely packed with hundreds of other young men and women who followed the exact same deeply traditional cultural blueprint and arrived at the exact same disastrous financial destination. The psychological dissonance Rachel experiences in this moment is incredibly severe. She must take her newly issued electronic benefit transfer card to the local grocery store, constantly terrified of being judged by members of her own congregation, who fiercely preach the gospel of self-sufficiency. The cultural shame is suffocating, yet the biological necessity of feeding her children overrides it. The sheer volume of these fractured households creates a massive, multi-billion-dollar administrative and financial crisis for the state. State governments in the Bible Belt are fundamentally structured to operate on incredibly low tax revenues, fiercely prioritizing corporate tax incentives and business deregulation over the funding of robust social safety nets. However, the staggering relentless rate of regional divorce actively forces these conservative governments to become massive, reluctant welfare administrators. They are forced to quietly funnel astronomical sums of taxpayer money into these survival programs just to prevent total societal collapse within their borders. This dynamic forces us to confront a highly uncomfortable macroeconomic reality regarding the flow of federal tax dollars across the United States. Because these specific state governments artificially suppress their own tax revenues while simultaneously generating massive populations of impoverished, single-parent households through their family court systems, they mathematically cannot afford to fund these safety nets independently. They must rely heavily on massive federal block grants like temporary assistance for needy families. This creates a fascinating, deeply ironic economic loop. The wealthy, coastal, progressive states that these conservative regions frequently criticize in the political arena are actually the primary financial sponsors keeping their local welfare systems afloat. The federal government essentially extracts tax revenue from highly educated, later marrying populations in regions with historically lower divorce rates, and funnels it directly into the southern states to subsidize the catastrophic financial fallout of their early marriage culture. The political rhetoric of the region heavily emphasizes fierce independence, but the hard demographic and financial data reveals a massive, systemic dependency on federal bailouts. This is the ultimate, inescapable irony of the red state paradox. The intense, religiously motivated cultural pressure to marry young, combined with a highly deregulated, low-friction legal dissolution process and a deeply punitive child support enforcement system, operates as an incredibly efficient, flawlessly designed machine for generating multi-generational state dependency. The community leaders who aggressively push young, Unestablished adults toward the altar to preserve traditional morality are inadvertently engineering the precise sociological conditions that lead to explosive welfare enrollment. They are systematically destroying the financial autonomy of their own communities and transforming their congregations into permanent wards of the state. The political leaders who campaign aggressively against the expansion of social programs are simultaneously presiding over a family law infrastructure that mathematically guarantees a perpetual, exponentially growing demand for those exact same government programs. It is a completely self-defeating ideological cycle that traps millions of families in perpetual poverty while draining the economic vitality of the entire geographic region. But the financial devastation of the Southern divorce machine is not merely a tragic story of impoverished parents and overwhelmed state budgets. While the families are systematically drained of their finite resources and the American taxpayers are forced to absorb the massive collateral damage, there is a specific, highly organized, and deeply entrenched sector of the local economy that is absolutely thriving on this chaos. We have spent significant time examining the victims of this system, but to truly understand the sheer power, the permanence, and the aggressive lobbying behind this demographic phenomenon, we must now follow the money directly into the pockets of the exact people who profit from the destruction. We are about to pull back the curtain on the multi-million-dollar divorce industrial complex that actively monetizes this regional heartbreak. We will reveal exactly how aggressive debt collection agencies, specialized family law firms, state-contracted enforcement entities, and localized bureaucratic agencies have built massive, highly lucrative financial empires entirely dependent on the continuous, never-ending fracturing of the Southern American family. To comprehend the sheer scale of this localized economic engine, we must first examine the hidden mechanisms of federal funding that actively incentivize aggressive state-level enforcement. In the United States, the federal government provides substantial financial grants to state agencies under a specific provision known as Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This program was originally designed with noble intentions, aiming to ensure that children in fractured households receive necessary financial support. However, in practical application, the structure of this federal legislation creates a highly perverse financial incentive for state governments across the South. The federal government literally reimburses these states for a massive percentage of their administrative costs associated with operating child support enforcement programs. Crucially, they also provide massive, multi-million-dollar financial performance bonuses based directly on the sheer volume of child support cases successfully established and the total dollar amount of funds aggressively collected. For a cash-strapped Southern state operating with historically low local tax revenues, this federal matching system transforms the local family court from an impartial mechanism of justice into a highly efficient, state-run collection agency that actively generates critical revenue for the local government. The state bureaucracy is structurally and financially incentivized to maximize the number of citizens entangled in the system and to maximize the dollar amounts ordered, regardless of the individual citizen's actual, real-world ability to pay those amounts. Imagine if you are an independent contractor named Thomas, residing in a rapidly growing county in Florida in the current year 2026. Thomas is desperately navigating the chaotic financial aftermath of his early, culturally pressured divorce. When the family court orders Thomas to pay a monthly obligation that mathematically consumes the vast majority of his functional, take-home income, the state is not merely ensuring his children are fed. The state is actively securing its own federal performance bonuses. Every single time Thomas makes a required payment, the state bureaucratic machinery counts that transaction as a successful performance metric to report back to the federal government, ensuring the continued flow of massive federal grant money into the state coffers. But what exactly happens when Thomas inevitably falters due to the immense, crushing economic pressures of 2026? This is where the private sector aggressively enters the equation and begins extracting astronomical profits from the situation. Many Southern states, operating under deeply conservative political philosophies that champion the privatization of government services, actively outsource the brutal logistics of collecting child support arrears to private, for-profit debt collection agencies. When Thomas misses a payment and falls into arrears, his debt is frequently transferred to one of these private corporate entities. These private agencies are legally permitted by the state to attach significant surcharges, exorbitant administrative fees, and aggressive interest rates directly onto his existing debt principal. They operate with the full, terrifying legal authority of the state government, utilizing automated, highly sophisticated systems to aggressively seize his bank accounts, intercept his federal tax returns, and execute the devastating wage garnishments we previously discussed. They are not compassionate social workers trying to rehabilitate a fractured family unit. They are highly compensated, ruthlessly efficient corporate entities operating on a profit margin dictated entirely by human misery and structural poverty. Furthermore, we must examine the localized legal ecosystem that absolutely thrives on the massive, continuous volume of these specific cases. While the initial standardized pro-se divorce might only cost a young couple a few $100s in county filing fees, the inevitable post-divorce modifications create a permanent, highly lucrative revenue stream for specialized family law practitioners across the region. Because the initial state-mandated child support orders are frequently mathematically impossible for the non-custodial parent to maintain over a long period, individuals like Thomas are eventually forced to return to the court system to request a formal legal modification of their monthly payments. However, unlike the initial streamlined divorce paperwork, navigating a formal modification to lower a support obligation requires navigating a complex, highly adversarial, and incredibly expensive legal labyrinth. Thomas cannot simply walk into a courtroom and logically explain his severe financial hardship to a judge. He must hire expensive private legal representation to formally petition the court, enter into prolonged, costly discovery phases, and battle aggressively against the state enforcement attorneys who are heavily incentivized by their own federal funding metrics to keep his monthly payments as high as physically possible. He is effectively forced to pay thousands of dollars in legal retainer fees to a private attorney, just to secure the legal permission to pay slightly less money to the state. It is an utterly absurd, closed-loop economic system where the only guaranteed potential outcome is the continuous forced transfer of finite wealth from the impoverished parents directly into the bank accounts of the legal and bureaucratic class. Let us look at a highly specific case study of this exact profit extraction model. Consider a woman named Sarah, living in a suburban district of Tennessee in 2026. She is the custodial parent, desperately relying on the state system to extract payments from her ex-husband simply to avoid eviction. When the state outsources the collection of those payments to a private corporate entity, or utilizes state-run electronic payment processing centers, those entities frequently charge mandatory processing fees simply to disperse the funds to Sarah. Therefore, the ex-husband is charged administrative fees and interest just to submit the money, and Sarah is effectively taxed on the receipt of the money through hidden electronic processing charges. The entire systemic infrastructure acts as a massive, unavoidable toll booth, systematically extracting a percentage of the capital as it forcefully moves from one impoverished household to another. This leads to a devastating and undeniable realization regarding the historical trends we are analyzing. The divorce industrial complex in the American South is not a broken system desperately in need of reform. It is a highly optimized, perfectly functioning financial system that is doing exactly what it was engineered to do, which is to cleanly convert the sociological tragedy of rapid marital dissolution into a reliable, continuously expanding revenue stream for the state government and its private corporate partners. The intensely traditional cultural engine pushes the young, unestablished adults blindly into the machinery. The libertarian legal framework processes their separation with brutal, deregulated efficiency, and the industrial complex violently extracts every last available cent from the resulting domestic wreckage. But as this massive, localized machinery grinds forward, systematically destroying the financial foundation and generational wealth potential of millions of Southern households in 2026, it is simultaneously creating an entirely new, deeply terrifying sociological phenomenon that the traditional community leaders are completely failing to recognize. When an entire generation of young adults watches their parents get completely obliterated by this exact cultural and legal system, they do not simply bow their heads and repeat the tragic mistakes of the past. Instead, they execute a drastic, unprecedented sociological rebellion that is currently threatening to completely collapse the entire cultural infrastructure of the Bible Belt from the inside out. We must now turn our full attention to the final explosive consequence of the red state paradox, a demographic shockwave that is actively rewriting the rules of human connection and redefining the very concept of the American family in real time. This demographic shockwave is fundamentally a massive, silent, and highly coordinated strike against the institution of early marriage. The generation currently reaching young adulthood in the American South, those navigating their early to mid-20s in the year 2026, possesses a distinct and incredibly powerful advantage over the generations that preceded them. They possess the brutal, unforgiving advantage of hindsight. They grew up as the primary collateral damage of the exact divorce machinery, we have meticulously mapped out over this entire masterclass. They were the children who were forcibly shuttled between divided, economically stressed households. They were the teenagers who watched their mothers sink into poverty under the crushing weight of mathematically flawed child support formulas. And they were the young adults who witnessed their fathers financially obliterated by the highly punitive state enforcement apparatus. Consequently, this emerging demographic is completely immune to the romanticized, traditional cultural messaging that successfully ensnared their parents. They have observed the historical trends from the front row, and they are actively choosing to completely opt out of the system. Imagine if you are a 24-year-old woman named Chloe, living in a rapidly expanding metropolitan area of Texas in 2026. Chloe's parents followed the exact traditional Bible Belt script. They married at 19, driven by intense religious and community pressure, and they endured a spectacular, financially devastating legal dissolution by the time Chloe was 7 years old. Today, Chloe's local community leadership and her extended family network still actively exert the exact same cultural pressure on her, heavily suggesting during Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings that her primary moral objective should be securing a husband and starting a family. However, Chloe looks at the historical trends of her own family tree. She analyzes the brutal macroeconomic realities of the 2026 inflation and housing markets, and she recognizes the catastrophic, asymmetric risk. She views the legal contract of marriage not as a mandatory milestone for community validation, but as a highly dangerous, potentially ruinous financial liability that she is utterly unwilling to take on without absolute certainty. Instead of rushing to the altar to appease the traditional expectations of her deeply conservative community, Chloe completely rejects the established timeline. She actively chooses a path of fierce, unprecedented financial independence. Her primary directive is not finding a spouse, but rather prioritizing the completion of her advanced education, securing a high-yield career trajectory in the tech or medical sector, and independently purchasing her own property or building a robust investment portfolio. When she does enter into a long-term romantic partnership, she fundamentally alters the traditional sequence of events. In direct, unapologetic defiance of the intense religious stigma against premarital cohabitation that previously governed the region, Chloe and millions of her peers are actively normalizing the domestic stress test. They are choosing to live together, to seamlessly blend their daily logistics, to openly discuss their credit scores, and to rigorously test their financial compatibility for years before ever allowing the state government to legally document their union. They are replacing the blind faith of their parents with cold, calculated, data-driven pragmatism. This widespread sociological rebellion is generating a profound, measurable disruption across the entire Southern economic and cultural landscape. We are actively witnessing a rapid historical collapse in the regional marriage rate. The local wedding industry, a multi-billion-dollar economic engine built entirely on the historical assumption of early, lavish, culturally mandated matrimonial ceremonies, is currently facing an existential crisis. Banquet halls, specialized photographers, and bridal boutiques across the Bible Belt are experiencing unprecedented contractions as their primary demographic simply refuses to participate in the tradition. Furthermore, this deliberate, highly calculated delay in marriage is mathematically accelerating the regional decline in birth rates. As young adults in the South prioritize intense economic stabilization and extensive compatibility testing over immediate reproduction, the fundamental demographic pyramid of the region is shifting permanently. They are choosing to have fewer children, or no children at all, directly out of a desire to prevent subjecting another generation to the economic trauma they themselves endured. The exact traditional institutions that historically engineered the pressure cooker are now experiencing a state of absolute, undeniable panic. Religious leadership and deeply conservative political figures are watching their youngest, most vital demographics walk out the door, recognizing that the threat of cultural shame no longer holds any structural power over a generation that has already survived the economic devastation of a broken home. The leverage is completely gone. The social fear of being an unmarried 20-something in the South is now vastly overshadowed by the absolute terror of repeating the financial destruction of their parents. In response, we are seeing panicked political attempts to introduce new historical trends, such as legislative proposals offering significant tax incentives or direct financial bonuses to young couples who choose to marry. However, these artificial state-sponsored incentives completely fail to address the core issue. A minor tax break cannot possibly offset the massive, systemic risk of a legal contract that has a statistically proven track record of destroying regional wealth. By actively delaying or entirely rejecting this institution, This generation is simultaneously executing a brilliant unintentional financial maneuver. They are actively starving the divorce industrial complex we previously exposed. If the citizens refuse to enter the heavily regulated legal contract of marriage until they are fully financially established and fundamentally compatible, the primary fuel source for the family court system, the private debt collectors, and the modification attorneys is drastically reduced. The machinery cannot monetize a legal fracture if the foundational contract was never signed in the first place. This demographic is effectively starving the beast by refusing to play the game by the established, deeply rigged rules. This brings us to the ultimate, profound realization regarding the red state paradox. The American South did not become the divorce capital of the nation because its citizens fundamentally disrespected the concept of family. It achieved that tragic status because its intense cultural idealism actively weaponized the legal system against the fragile realities of young, unestablished couples. By relentlessly pushing adolescents directly into binding legal contracts without the necessary economic or psychological scaffolding, the culture effectively guaranteed its own statistical failure. We have successfully dismantled the illusion and exposed the exact economic, psychological, and legal frameworks that govern this massive demographic reality. You now possess a comprehensive, master-level understanding of the invisible forces that dictate marital outcomes across the United States. But as this new generation actively tears down the old timeline and builds a highly pragmatic blueprint for human connection, they are leaving behind a massive, rapidly expanding void in the traditional real estate and consumer markets. Because when millions of young adults permanently abandon the dream of the traditional nuclear family and choose instead to navigate the modern American economy as permanently single, highly autonomous financial entities, they trigger an entirely new catastrophic shockwave that is currently completely destabilizing the national housing market and fundamentally altering how homes are built and sold in this country. And that terrifying economic ripple effect, where the death of the American family forces a complete restructuring of the American physical landscape, is exactly what we need to map out next.